Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, we're going to have on former Grand Forks Herald publisher. He's still a columnist for the Grand Forks Herald and other newspapers. Mike Jacobs, obviously a longtime reporter, political observer in the state. Talk with him a little bit about what's going on at the University of North Dakota. Obviously, we had a big interview on the podcast on Friday. Chris Engelstad-McGarry had some tough things to say for University of North Dakota President Mark Kennedy. Leading up to that, I had broken some pretty big stories about Mr. Kennedy and his personnel decisions at the University of North Dakota, his chief of staff getting a $30,000 a year raise and being allowed to commute from Texas at a cost of up to $25,000 a year to the university, also employing a former associate, a friend, basically to work part-time as the interim director of the Center for Innovation at roughly twice the previous director's salary, only working part-time, though, 20 hours a week, and commuting from Boston, which cost the University of North Dakota nearly $30,000 during his time working for the school. So there's been a lot going on, and I wanted to get Mike's point of view on everything as somebody who has covered the University of North Dakota for a long time, covered higher education in North Dakota for a long time. So listen to that. But before we get to the interview, I wanted to do that. There was been a number of letters to the editor that have been aimed at me of late in some of the various newspapers around the state. I get a lot of feedback on any given day, letters to the editor, emails, phone calls, texts, Facebook messages, you name it. It can be at times hard to keep up with it. But some of these letters I thought were interesting, and I thought maybe I would devote the rant on today's show to responding to some of them. So up first, I wanted to respond to a letter by a gentleman by the name of Shane, and I apologize if I butcher his last name. I think it's Thielges. It's Thielges. Shane, if you're listening, I apologize for not pronouncing your last name correctly. The headline over his letter is, "What skin does Port have in the game?" And he goes on and he complains about how I pontificate on the political matters of the day, invariably from an uncompromising right-wing perspective. Well, I would say that I just write about what's going on from a conservative perspective. That's my job. I'm a conservative columnist, blogger, podcaster. You know, I don't know what you want out of me. There's plenty of people on the left who do it. I do it from a right-wing perspective. I think I represent a pretty common worldview here in North Dakota, but whatever. He's upset about reading opinions in the newspaper that he doesn't necessarily like. And then he goes and he says I wrote too much about Heidi Heitkamp and during the election, which again was a common complaint from Heidi Heitkamp supporters. How dare anybody be critical of an incumbent senator in the middle of one of the most hotly contested Senate races in the country? Oh, man, what a terrible thing I did. But then he complains about my criticism of Measure 1. Now, those of you who have been following this, Measure 1 was approved on last year's ballot. It was a constitutional measure, supposedly to promote ethics, although really I think it's about speech suppression. I think it's about raising the bar on entry into the political debate to make it more difficult, to make it more expensive, to create more trepidation among average members of the public who might want to participate. You look at some of the groups backing Measure 1 and Citizens United, literally named after a Supreme Court decision that struck down regulations of political speech. These people are not pro-free speech. These people are about strangling free speech, strangling political expression, political participation with regulation and laws. That's what Measure 1 was, masquerading as ethics. But he goes on and he says, he suggests that Shane in his letter suggests that I may be motivated by something untoward. Essentially, I may be bought off by interest. He writes, I quote, "I consider this a reasonable matter of public interest. Would Port be willing to divulge whether he is compensated by any entity or organization, political or private, to discuss certain topics or espouse certain opinions in his columns?" If you do what I do long enough, people make this accusation of you. But let me just be clear about this. I'm an employee of Forum Communications Company. That's my only source of income. I don't take payments from anybody else. All of the advertising on sayanythingblog.com goes to Forum Communications Company. Obviously, the other platforms I work on, they handle everything and they give me a paycheck. That's been that way since 2016. Prior to that, I worked for a conservative libertarian nonprofit called the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. This organization, again, had conservative / I would say libertarian leanings. There was a lot of heavy breathing, I know, at one point that it was an organization funded by the Koch brothers. They could have been. I don't know. They didn't disclose their donors, and I didn't have anything to do with the money. They gave me a paycheck. I wrote for their website called watchdog.org. I also wrote for sayanythingblog.com. They never told me what to write. Every once in a while, there would be stories that they weren't that interested in. They tended not to like social issues that much. They also didn't like horse race campaign type stories. They really were focused on issues and government waste and government accountability, things like that. They employed reporters across the country. I was one of them working here in North Dakota. Was very happy with that arrangement. Prior to Watchdog, I worked for Scott Hennon, who is a long-term talk radio host in our region. He had a media company at the time that I blogged for. I did on-air stuff for him. We did that for a few years, and prior to Scott Hennon, I worked in the private sector. I worked for my father as a private investigator for 10 years. He's a retired law enforcement officer and started a detective agency here in North Dakota when he retired. I did things like background checks, surveillance, insurance fraud. I even assisted him in criminal defense cases. It was an interesting time in my life, and I learned a lot of skills, frankly, that I continue to use today. I also managed a retail store at one point. But I will say this, never once has anybody paid me to write a specific thing. I have been paid to generate content, but it's always been the content of my choosing. I've always decided what I write. I've always decided the positions that I take, and frankly, that hasn't changed in the 16 years that I've been doing this. Now another letter, this one published in the Fargo Forum by Cynthia Benson, headline, Port appears to care more about North Dakota's image than public safety. Now, she's writing about a recent print column that I wrote about, and I think we discussed it here on the podcast as well. Essentially, I don't like the way we measure the DUI problem, the drunk driving problem in North Dakota and in other places. Now, the issue at hand was a website called Insurify. They're a company that basically does insurance quotes, and they try to direct you to insurance policies. So what happens is websites like that put out studies, and these studies essentially I'm putting air quotes around studies because really they just sort of slap together some data, they do a state ranking, and then they pitch it to reporters, hoping that reporters will write the article and mention their website and drive traffic to them. It's not really about informing the public or informing public policy, although unfortunately these articles often do. Rather, it's about selling insurance or selling credit cards. Sometimes those are the type of companies that do these. Anyway, my whole point was that DUI statistics aren't necessarily a good measure for how safe our roads are. And the example that I used is that a state that puts a lot of money into DUI enforcement is going to see more arrests. But does that mean that state has a bigger drunk driving problem? Or are they just doing more about it? You could argue that a state with fewer DUI arrests might be putting less money or less time, less resources behind enforcement, and in fact, their roads are less safe. To me, I think the statistics we should care about are alcohol-related fatalities, alcohol-related deaths, alcohol-related incidents or property damage. I mean, those are the things we should be measuring because those are the things we want to reduce. The point of making drunk driving illegal is not so we can see how many people we can arrest. The point is to make our roads safer. And if we arrest a whole bunch of people or we don't arrest a whole bunch of people, and it doesn't really make any difference one way or the other about how safe our roads are, then what was the point? Now, the letter writer, she seems to think that my point is that we shouldn't enforce the law at all. And to be fair, I was a little facetious with the headline saying that the best way to lower North Dakota's DUI rates is to stop enforcing the law. That was not a proposal. I was not suggesting that. I was just meaning to illustrate that the DUI arrest statistic really doesn't tell us much about anything. But she thinks that that's my point. She writes, by concluding that DUI arrest numbers and safety are not related and failing to research the issue further, Port minimizes the serious problem of alcoholism, drinking, and driving in North Dakota. He seems more concerned about North Dakota's image than the actual welfare of its citizens. Now, that's not actually true. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wrote in my column that DUI, I don't think North Dakota does that well in terms of alcohol-related accidents either. I think even by the metrics that I'm proposing, North Dakota still doesn't do that well. And the reason why is North Dakota's got a drinking culture. North Dakota's got a lot of long roads home. And North Dakota doesn't have a lot of public transit. Getting a ride home, a safe ride home from the bar sometimes isn't convenient. Now, that's not an excuse for people not doing it. It's just that it's hard, and it results in a lot of DUIs. And North Dakotans, I would even say it's fair to say that there are some prevalent and very unhealthy attitudes about drinking and driving prevalent in North Dakota and in other places in our region. But I'm not saying that that's okay. And I'm not saying that we should accept that. I'm just saying that endlessly talking about DUI arrests doesn't really tell us much of anything. I mean, yeah, if we got a lot of DUI arrests, I guess it means there were a lot of people out drunk driving on the road. But again, what we care about is safety, not seeing how many people we can arrest. And that was my point, and I stand behind it. Finally, a third letter, which referenced me in a recent interview that I did with Congressman Kelly Armstrong here on the podcast. This letter was published in the Bismarck Tribune as well as the Minot Daily. The Bismarck Tribune headline was, North Dakota already has forms of socialism. Now, I did a rant about this on a previous podcast where I think people who are trying to promote socialism are using a tactic where they water down the definition of socialism by redefining a lot of not at all controversial things the government does as socialism in order to make socialism itself less controversial. Now, this letter to the editor from Cody Stanley of Grand Forks says this, I quote, Representative Kelly Armstrong recently said on Rob Port's podcast that socialism has failed everywhere. This was surprising to hear because North Dakota has two huge socialist institutions, a state bank and a state mill. The state of North Dakota owns them. Moreover, by the state owning them, they are better able to serve the unique needs of the people of North Dakota. Both of them are highly profitable and provide countless necessary services to the people of North Dakota. Armstrong's words underscore the fundamental problem with the Republican Party today. Republicans are dominated by their rhetoric that call all forms of democratic socialism are bad. That's how he wrote the sentence. The cold, hard fact is that they are not. Police, public schools, all forms of street maintenance, especially our snow removal crews, firefighters, public water, rural electricity regulations that allow most of North Dakota to have power, and the aforementioned Bank of North Dakota and State Mill and Elevator are successful and necessary democratic socialist institutions. Now, you can see what he's doing here. First of all, a lot of people have been glib about calling North Dakota state-owned bank and North Dakota state-owned grain mill socialist institutions. They're really not. Socialism would mean that you can only bank at the Bank of North Dakota, or you can only bring your grain to the grain mill, to the state-owned grain mill. Those things aren't true. Private grain mills exist across North Dakota. Private banking exists across North Dakota. The fact that the state of North Dakota, the government, owns two of these institutions does not suddenly make us in a socialist state. Also, the idea that we plow the snow, the government plows the snow from the streets, and now we're a socialist nation. This is absurd. And again, I think this is really about whitewashing the ugly reality of what socialism is. Socialism is an ugly ideology that requires an enforced sort of equality through the government. Right? I mean, that's what Karl Marx called for. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And the problem with socialism is that in order to accomplish that, you got to have a bureaucrat standing there with a clipboard. And then you got to have some people with guns there to protect the person with the clipboard. Because I'm telling you, if the government starts taking things away from one group of people and giving them to another group of people, you got to have some way to enforce that. And the problem is that is an awesome amount of power to give the government, and inevitably it corrupts. Socialism is not the government doing things, right? Socialism is not the government, having a law enforcement agency, right? I mean, no society with laws can live without law enforcement. What good are laws written down if we have no mechanisms through which to enforce them and ensure that people abide by them? I mean, to say that the existence of a police force is to say that every government that has had a police force is socialist, which is ridiculous. Yes, the government provides us with some services, and yes, we have an endless debate about which services the government should provide and how lavish should those services be and how much should we pay for them and how much should the private sector be allowed. I mean, those are debates we have all the time about the proper size and scope of government. We have them in the state of North Dakota, we have them in the United States of America as a whole, and none of it makes us a socialist country. But I think the socialists, who are, again, constantly trying to rehabilitate this ugly ideology of theirs, that's what they want you to believe. Now, the funny thing about these socialists is that socialism to them is always whatever works, and it's never really what doesn't work. I mean, the people who are literally socialists, the Soviets and the Cubans under Castro and the North Koreans under the Kims, those are socialists. And the suffering under those regimes, that's where it leads. Pol Pot in Vietnam. I mean, I could go on and on. But that's where it leads. Right? I mean, even Romania under Ceausescu. I mean, that's socialism. That's what it is. Socialism is not the local county plowing your road. Socialism is the government deciding how much you should get, how much everybody should get. Socialism is controlling the grocery store to make sure that everybody gets the same amount. That's socialism. And I understand that the quote-unquote democratic socialists today, they want us to believe that they're just like the rest of us, but they're really not. I mean, a lot of them, they're waving that hammer and sickle flag. They're out there espousing an ideology that has hurt people, literally hurt people. Now, I don't think people like Cody Stanley, who wrote this letter, I don't think that they really want to hurt people. I just think they're kind of idiots. I just think that they're stupidly glomming on, like many, many, many people before them, to an ideology that sounds good on paper, but has never worked, despite the old saw about how real socialism, true socialism, has never really been tried. Yes, it has. Doesn't work. That's it for the rants. Mike Jacobs, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Mike Jacobs, who is the former publisher of the Grand Forks Herald, longtime journalist and reporter in the state of North Dakota, joins me to talk about some of the things that have been happening in Grand Forks and specifically at the University of North Dakota. It's certainly been some interesting developments, been some controversy over some of the personnel decisions that President Kennedy has made, and now the Engelstad family has weighed in. They were actually on last week's Friday podcast. Chris Engelstad McGarry, who is a spokeswoman for the family and a trustee of the Engelstad Foundation, saying that they are not going to withhold, they are going to withhold donations from the University of North Dakota until President Kennedy is gone. Not all donations. I know they have some commitments to scholarships, and they said they weren't going to do anything to hurt students, but in terms of, new funding for a building or whatever, they're not going to make those sorts of donations going forward until President Kennedy is gone. Now, I asked Engelstad McGarry point blank if she thought that the university should move on for President Kennedy. She kind of demurred the first time I asked. The second time around, she gave me a yes, although I notice in subsequent reports, she's now saying that they aren't calling for him to be fired. So I don't know. I know what she told me. I guess maybe they're a little hesitant about that. And maybe Mike, they should be, because I'm not so sure in terms of the cause of getting, if their cause is they want to get President Kennedy out there, I'm not sure a foundation swinging their money around might prove to be counterproductive.
Well, I think that's true. I was disappointed that Chris Engelstad McGarry went as far as she did in suggesting that the president be fired. I don't think we're quite there. I've been critical of Mark Kennedy actually from the day that he was hired. I pointed out in a column then that I thought his self-regard might get in the way of his ability to maneuver in the North Dakota academic and political and cultural climate, and that has proven true. But I don't think that I think that events need to be weighed in against both against consequences and consequences and context. The context here, of course, is that there's been dissatisfaction and controversy about presidential leadership at NDSU for more than a decade, and at UND for about the same length of time, and that is it's occurring on both campuses. There were calls for Joe Chapman to leave, and eventually he did. There have been calls for Dean Brashani to leave NDSU. Kendall Baker at UND back in the early 90s was essentially showing the door. There was controversy about both of his successors, and now about his actually the fourth person to come in. So this is not new, and the real issue here, I think, is that we have yet to resolve in North Dakota exactly what it is we want the university system to do and how it is we want the university system to be governed.
Yeah.
And in that context, it's not surprising that presidents have taken steps that later got them in trouble, because there's been a lack of forceful direction on the part of the board.
Well,
and
go
ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I wanted to talk to that point, because that was something Engelson McGarry mentioned it, and honestly, I agree with her on this point. I broke those two stories about the special assistant who got all of a sudden a big raise, $30,000 a year. Now she's chief of staff, and now she's going to be commuting from Texas and getting an allowance of $25,000 a year to do that. We had a former Kennedy, they worked together at Shopko. Gentleman by the name of Barry Horowitz, who came in and served at the Center for Innovation as an interim director, making roughly twice what the previous longtime director made, and also only working 20 hours a week on average. His contract literally said 80 hours a month, and he was commuting from Boston. And so those are just a couple of things that stuck out, and obviously I run those. So we have a State Board of Higher Ed meeting, and some of the comments at the State Board of Higher Ed meeting to me were kind of frustrating. The chairman of the board, Don Morton, is like, well, we don't really have the expertise on this stuff. We leave this stuff to the campus. Board member Kathy Nessett saying the same thing. Basically, she had some concerns about the decisions, but, this is the job of the president, and it's not really the board's responsibility to weigh in. And then you have Chancellor Hagerott, who comes out and gives a quote. He says during the meeting, on the record, right out in public, that, he didn't feel like he gave this glowing review to President Kennedy, didn't mention any of the problems at the school, not just the recent scandals, but they've struggled to find a dean at the UND Law School. There's been complaints of low morale on campus. There's a lot going on at UND. The evaluation, though, was basically hagiography. It was glowing. And, he was asked by board member Dan Traynor, why didn't you include any criticism in this? And he said, basically, I didn't feel it was appropriate to write that sort of stuff down candidly. Now, to me, I'm thinking, what's the point of an evaluation if you can't candidly talk about the person you're evaluating? And also, if not the board's job to hold the presidents accountable, being the body that hires and fires them, then what is the board doing? I saw those things, and to me, that speaks to the governance problem right there. Did you agree, or what did you see?
Well, I think that in the course of the last 20 years or so, the board has become remarkably weaker than it was at the time that it was conceived and voted into law. And some changes were made in the way the board is structured, particularly in the terms and the possibility of reappointment that have weakened the board, partly because it makes the board more dependent on the political wind, so to speak. So if you're asked to serve on the Board of Higher Education, you suddenly find yourself being in the public arena in ways that might discourage you from seeking to continue on the board and becoming a more effective member and potentially a more informed and assertive leader. So it has reduced the enthusiasm of North Dakotans to serve on the board. I think that's something that the governor has complained about, that other governors have pointed out. So I think that we need to consider how the board itself is structured. I'm not an enthusiast about separate boards for institutions.
Yeah,
I think that actually worsens the problem, because it creates the possibility of a much closer, even chummy, and even self-involved governance of the institutions that would eclipse what we have now. So I think that the issue is finding effective board members who see in board membership a real opportunity for service. We could go back to the days of the in the 60s and 70s, when the board was a much different thing than it is now.
Yeah, well, I think there's some things we could do, like maybe we could pay the board members more and make it more attractive to people who might want to serve. I mean, because it's a significant amount of time, and I'm not sure they're compensated adequately. And I know that sometimes people look askance at that, paying them more, but maybe we get better people if we pay. Sometimes you get what you pay for, and
right. If we want. The model we have here is a strong board, and that's making the policy, and at least it seems to me this is what we want. Yeah. We want a strong board that hires well, that makes forward-thinking decisions, and so on.
Yeah.
I think we there's probably fairly broad agreement that board is not as effective as it should be.
Yeah.
And this is, anybody who's been around North Dakota any length of time knows that these issues are not limited to one campus. They have occurred in various places. Williston State College, for example.
Yes.
UND, NDSU, and Dickinson. There's something here that points rather than to troubles on one campus, to troubles in the way the system is structured.
I have always felt, and I think I've been loud and clear on this point, and we need. I look at it, and it seems like the campuses have political constituencies built in, right? Like UND, NDSU in particular have very large networks of alumni who are often go on to be in very influential positions. They have very large sports fans are a very loud constituency on these issues. Frankly, the hometown media sometimes can be a little bit of a homer for the hometown university. So I think
in Grand Forks, just to be clear, in Grand Forks there are a lot of people, including the people on campus and in and around the president, who think that the Herald is part of the reason that they can't get the kind of traction they want. I mean, there's a lot of media bashing in higher education.
Well, there is.
And Brashani actually also beat up on the media. He has called the media environment atypically hostile, or words to that effect.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the issue we're talking about, but certainly I think that's fair. And I mean, to be fair, both the Grand Forks Herald and the Fargo Forum belong to the company I work for, and they publish my stuff, and I am very critical. So I don't want to go too overboard with that. But there are issues I think sometimes where the Grand Forks Herald is for UND, and the Minot Daily is for Minot State. It's not. And I'm not saying there's anything untoward about that. I'm just saying it's a constituency sometimes. And I look at, and the board doesn't have that, though. I mean, there's no network of alumni or sports fans or anybody else who's really going to stand behind the board. And I think even though the governor appoints the board, the governor doesn't really have a lot of incentive to use his political clout, or her, and as may be the case in the future, to use their political clout to defend the board. I mean, usually the governors are handoff by tradition, going all the way back to that infamous story about Bill Langer and everything else. And I'm not so sure that that's helped, because I feel like the board's just kind of stuck twisting in the wind. They don't have any really incentive to take the hard line. And so for them, hands-off is easier.
Well, there's no doubt that hands-off is easier, and in fact, I think that that I could cite recent examples in which the board has consciously taken an easier path, and I think there's a feeling that we got to do something, so we'll do the easy thing, and but the board has it. The board has at critical junctures said, and maybe this is one of those where they said we want a stronger job review system. We want to be more involved in these kinds of decisions. That occurred with Dean Brashani 2 years ago.
Yeah.
When his contract was held up.
And by the way, I think that's paid dividends. I perceive I am.
Oh, I do too.
Absolutely. I've been one of his biggest critics. I feel like he's doing better.
Absolutely, and one of the things that's unfortunate about the timing of this whole dust up is that I thought that Mark Kennedy had begun to gain some traction, particularly in the community. The vote on the student union, as I said in a column some time ago, was essentially the students saying, we get the direction that the president's trying to go here, but then of course the personnel decisions that came up have cost a lot of goodwill, particularly among faculty who are looking at compensation that doesn't compare with what and perks that don't compare with what the chief of staff either at UND or at NDSU are getting. The chief of staff at NDSU was hired in a flagrant challenge to the legislature.
I made an issue about that back when it happened. Back when the legislature pulled the attorneys away from the campuses and put them all at the university system, and then Prashani, basically made his attorney his chief of staff and paid him. I think he's making
more money,
$170,000 a year. I think is what he's making.
Right. So I'm trying to take. And I am a UND alumnus, and Suzette and I have given the UND, and we care deeply about UND's success. But when you back up a little bit, UND is not the only player in the uncertainty and the I don't want to call it a crisis because I don't think it's a crisis, but
I agree.
in the current situation facing higher education, you wouldn't have to pull the veil back very far to find a whole bunch of missteps that in the instance created some concern, but over the long run have piled up in a way that really has to be managed, and we don't seem to have either the organization, the governance structure, or the will to manage those situations.
I think that you and I agree that because the central governance, the State Board of Higher Education, is a little too weak, that the tail wags the dog sometimes. In fact, a lot of the
that's
time.
Clear.
Yeah. So I think that's a problem. Let me ask you one final question. Do you think that we put too much importance in the position of university president? And let me explain to you why I'm asking that question. A while ago, I read an article that said part of the problem with a lot of the chaos that we're seeing at the national level of the American system of government is that we've made the president too much. Right, the president, comes in and vision, and the president's doing all these things, and whether you want to talk about it from the front of, executive orders and overstepping the constitutional bounds of the executive, we've turned the presidency into a sort of almost elected monarchy, and in some ways, we're setting presidents up for failure. I wonder if we're doing that, because I look at some of the talk, we pay six figures to a consulting firm, and they come in and they bring in all these candidates, and it's now, we're passing laws and we're making parts of it more secret. Pretty soon I think we're going to select presidents like they select popes, and we're going to be waiting for a puff of smoke out of a chimney. I wonder if we're just putting too much into the mystique of these presidents. And maybe we ought to be doing more promoting from within and be a little less concerned about trying to recruit some rock star from some other part of the country.
I absolutely agree with that. I've written about this a number of times. I think that one of in the final analysis, the presidents of NDSU and UND that we look back to as successful failed to train successors. That frankly is one of the things that, if you work in the corporate environment, is drilled into you. You're not going to be here forever. You have to train somebody to take the job, and that's been a failure, I think, of the North Dakota system. And partly it is because we're gobsmacked by what's happening in other places. We feel like we have to compete financially for big names in higher education. And we can't afford it, and big names aren't always what will be able to get the job done. So I agree with you that celebrity presidents is not something that serve us particularly well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mike.
I'm talking about campuses here.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right, Mike. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes are released Monday through Friday, right away in the morning, so you can start your day with Plain Talk. Or you can listen in the afternoon or late at night, really whenever you want to. That's the beauty of podcasts. You should be able to find the podcast on any of the available podcasting platforms that are out there. Just search for Plain Talk with Rob Port. I was actually testing this on a bunch of the services. I downloaded a bunch of the apps and just searched and make sure that we're listed properly. We can be found. Didn't have any problems, but if you ever have problems, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'm happy to help out. Even if you're just new to podcasts, don't feel like it's a dumb question. I'm happy to help. I want you listening. Also, if you have any feedback on the show, if you have any questions for our weekly guests, Congressman Kelly Armstrong or Senator Kevin Cramer, email those to rob@sayanythingblog.com as well. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.